Hello friends, myself Vedant. So today we are going to see chapter 6 life processes of science. So how do we tell the difference between what is alive and what is not alive? If we see a dog running or a cow chewing cud or a man shouting loudly on the street, we know that these are living beings.
What if a dog or cow or the cow or a man were asleep? We would still think that they were alive. But how did we know that?
We see them breathing and we know that they are alive. What about plants? How do we know that they are alive?
We can see them green. Some of us will say, but what about plant that have leaves of color other than green?
They grow over time, so we know that they are alive. Some will say. In other words, we tend to think of some sort of movement, either growth related or not, as common evidence for being alive.
But but a plant that is out not visibly growing is still alive, and some animals can breathe without visible movement.
So, using visible movement as the defining characteristic of life is not enough.
Movements over very small scale will be invisible to the naked eyes. Movements of molecules, for example, is the invisible molecular movement necessary for life.
If we ask this question to professional biologists, they will say yes. In fact, viruses do not show any molecular movement in them until they infect some cell, and that is partly why there is a controversy about whether they are truly alive or not.
What are molecular movement need for, why are molecular movement needed for life? We have seen in either classes that living organisms are well organized structures. They can have tissues have cells have smaller compounds in them, and so on.
Because of the effects of the environment, this organized order nature of living structure is very likely to keep breaking down. Living creatures must keep repairing and maintaining their structures.
since Since all these structures are made up of molecules, they must they must move molecules all around the time. What are the maintenance process in living organisms? Let us explore.
What are life processes? The maintenance functions of living organisms must go on even when they are not doing anything particular.
Even when we are just sitting in Even when we are just sitting in class, even if we are just asleep, this maintenance job have to go on.
The processes which together perform this maintenance job are life processes.
Since these maintenance processes are needed to prevent damage and breakdown, energy is needed for them.
This energy comes from outside the body of the individual organism,
So there must be a process to transfer a source of energy from outside the body of the organism.
which we call food, to the inside, a process we commonly call nutrition.
If the body size of organism is to grow, additional raw material will also be needed from outside.
Since life on Earth depends on carbon based molecules, most of these food sources are also carbon based.
Depending on the complexity of these carbon sources, different organisms can then use different kind of nutritional processes.
The outside sources of energy could be quite varied since the environment is not under the control of the individual organism.
This This source of energy therefore needed to be break down or build up in the body and must of be finally converted to a uniform source of energy that can be used for the various molecular movements needed for maintaining living structures as well as to the kind of molecules the body needed to grow.
For this, series of chemical reaction in the body are necessary. Oxiding reducing reactions are some of the most common chemical means to break down molecules.
For this, mainly organisms use oxygen source from outside the body.
The process of acquiring oxygen from outside the body and to use it in the process of breakdown of food sources for cellular needs is what we call respiration.
In the case of a single celled organism, no specific organisms for taking in food, exchange of gases, or removal of waste may be needed because the entire surface of the organism is in contact with the environment. But what happens when the body size of the organism increase and the body designs become more complex? In multicellular organism, all the cells all the cells may not be in direct contact with the surrounding environment.
Thus, simple diffusion will not meet the requirement of the cells.
We have we have seen previously how in multicellular organisms various body parts have specified in the function they perform.
We are familiar with the idea of the specialized tissue and with their organism in the body. We are familiar with the idea of the specialized tissue and with the organization in the body of organism.
It is therefore not surprising that the uptake of the body of the organism.
It is therefore not surprising that uptake of food and of oxygen will also be the function of specialized tissue. However, This poses a problem since the food and oxygen are now taken up to taken up at one place in the body of the organism while all parts of the body need them.
This situation creates a need for a transportation system for carrying food and oxygen from one place to another in the body.
When chemical reaction use the carbon source and the oxygen for energy generation, they create byproducts that are not only useless for the cells of the body but could even be harmful.
These waste byproducts, these waste byproducts, the cell of are therefore needed to be removed from the body and discarded outside by a process called excretion.
Again, if the basic rules for body Again, if the basic rules for body design in multicellular organisms are followed, a specialized tissue for excretion will be developed, which means that the transportation system will need to transport waste away from cell to this excre- excretory tissue.
Let us consider these various processes so essential to maintain life one by one.
Nutrition. When we walk or ride a bicycle, we are using up energy.
Even when we are not doing any apparent activity, energy is needed to maintain a state of order in our body.
We also need materials from outside in order to grow, develop, synthesize protein and other substances needed in the body.
These sources of energy and materials is the food we eat.
How do living things get their food? The general requirement for energy and material is common in all organisms, but it is fulfilled in different ways.
Some organisms use simple food material obtained from inorganic source in the form of carbon dioxide and water.
These organisms, the these organisms, the autotrophs, include green plants and some bacteria. Other organisms utilize complex substances. These complex substances have to be broken down into simpler ones before they can be used for the upkeep and growth of the body. To achieve these organisms use biocatalysts called enzymes. Thus, the heterotroph's survival depends directly or indirectly on autotrophs. Heterotrophic organisms include animals and fungi.
Autotrophic nutrition, carbon and energy requirements of the autotrophic organisms are fulfilled by photosynthesis. It is the process take by which autotrophs take in substance from the outside and convert them into stored form of energy. This material is taken in form of carbon dioxide and water, which is converted into carbohydrate in the presence of sunlight and chlorophyll. Carbohydrate are utilized to providing energy to the plants. We will study how this take place in the next session. The carbohydrates which study how this take place in next session. Carbohydrate which are not used immediately are stored into form of starch, which serves as the internal energy reserves to be used as and when required by the plant. And somewhat similar situation is seen in us, where some of the energy derived from the food we eat is stored in our body in the form of glucogen.
Six CO2 is equal to 12 H2O. Chlorophyll plus sunlight is equal to C6H12O6 glucose plus 6O2 plus 6H2O. Let us now see what actually happens during the process of photosynthesis. The following events occur during this process. First, absorption of light energy by chlorophyll. Second, conversion of light energy to chemical energy and splitting of water molecule into hydrogen and oxygen. Third, reduction of carbon dioxide to carbohydrates.
These steps need to take place one after the another immediately. For example, desert plants take up carbon dioxide at night and prepare an intermediate which is acted upon by the energy absorbed by the chlorophyll during the day.
Let us see how each of the components of the above reaction are necessary for photosynthesis. If you carefully observe a cross section of a leaf under the microscope, shown in figure 6.1, you will notice that some cells contain green dots. These green dots are cell organelles called chloroplast, which contain chlorophyll.
Let us do an activity which demonstrates that chlorophyll is essential for photosynthesis.
Now let us study how the plant obtain carbon dioxide. In class 9th, we had talked about some stomata, which are tiny pores present on the surface of the leaves.
Massive amount of greenhouse massive amount of green gaseous exchange takes place in the leaves through these pores for the purpose of photosynthesis.
But it is important to note here that exchange of gases occurs across the surface of stems, roots and leaves as well.
Since a large amount of water can also be lost through these stomata, the plant closes through pores when it does not need carbon dioxide for photosynthesis.
The opening and closing of the pore is a function of the guard cell.
The guard cells use when water flows into them, causing the stomata pores to open. Similarly, the pore close if the guard cell shrinking.
Based on the two activities performed above, can we design an experiment to demonstrate that sunlight is essential for photosynthesis? So far, we have talked about how autotrophs meet their energy requirements.
But they also need other raw materials for building their body.
Water used in photosynthesis is taken up from the soil by the roots in terrestrial plants.
Other other materials like nitrogen, phosphorus, iron, and interterrestrial iron and magnesium are taken up from the soil.
Nitrogen is an essential element used in the synthesis of proteins and other compounds.
This is this is taken up in the form of inorganic nitrates or nitrates.
Or it is taken up as organic compounds which have been prepared by bacteria from atmospheric nitrogen.
6, 6, 6.2.2 heterotropic heterotropic nutrition. Each organism is adapted to its environment.
The form of nutrition differs depending on the type of availability of food material as well as how it is obtained by the organism.
For example, whether the food whether the food source is stationary such as grass or mobile such as deer would allow for difference in how the food is assessed and what is the nutritive apparatus used by a cow and a lion.
There is a range of strategies by which the food is taken in and used by the organism.
Some organisms break down the food materials outside the body and
Examples are fungi like bread molds, yeast, and mushrooms. Others take in whole material. Others take in whole material and break it down inside their bodies.
what can be taken in and broken down depends on the body design and functionation.
Some other organisms derive nutrition from plants or animals without killing them. This parasitic nutritive strategy is used by a wide variety of organisms like cuscuta, amarbel, ticks, lice, leeches, and tapeworms.
How do organisms obtain their nutrition? Since the food and the way it is obtaining differ, the digestive system is different in various organisms. In single-celled organism, the food may be taken in by the entire surface, but as a complexity of the organism increase, different part becomes specialized to perform different function. For example, amoeba takes in food using temporary fingers like extension of the cell surface which fuse over the food particles forming a food vacuoles. Inside the food vacuoles, complex substance are broken down into simpler one which then diffuse into the cytoplasm.
The remaining undigested material is moved to the surface of the cell and throughout. In Paramecium, which is also a unicellular organism, the cell has a definite shape and food is taken in at a specific spot. Food is moved to the spot by the movement of cilia which cover the entire surface of the cell.
Nutrition in human being. The alimentary canal is basically a long tube extending from the mouth extend the alimentary canal is basically a long tube extending from the alimentary canal is basically a long tube extending from the mouth to the anus. In figure 6.6, we can see that the tube has different parts. Various regions are specialized to perform different functions.
What happens to the food once it enters our body? We shall discuss this process here.
We eat various type of food which has to pass through the same digestive tract.
Naturally, the food has to process to generate particles which are small and of the same texture.
This is achieved by crushing the food with our teeth.
Since the lining of the canal is soft, the food is also weighted to make its passage smooth.
When we eat something we like, our mouth waters.
This is actually not only water, but a fluid called saliva secreted by the salivary glands.
Another aspect of food we ingest is its complex nature.
If it is to be absorbed from the alimentary canal, it has to be broken into smaller molecules. This is done with the help of biological catalysts called enzymes. The saliva contains an enzyme called salivary amylase that breaks down the starch, which is complex molecule to give sugar. The food is mixed truly with saliva and moved around the mouth while chewing by the muscular tongue.
It is necessary to move the food in a regulated manner along the digestive tube so that each can be processed properly in each part. The lining of canal can muscular that contract rhythmically in order to push a food forward. This practicalist movement occurs all along the gut. From the mouth, the food is taken to the stomach through the food pipe or esophagus. The stomach is an large organ with which expands when food enters it. The muscular wall of the stomach help in mixing the food thoroughly with more digestive juices.
These digestion functions are taken care of the gastric glands present in the wall of the stomach.
These release hydrochloric acid and protein digest enzyme called pepsin and muscles. The hydrochloric acid creates an acidic medium which faculties the uh, facilitate the action of the enzyme pepsin. What other functions do you think is served by the acid? The mucus protects the inner lining of the stomach from the action of the acid under normal condition. We we often heard complaining about adult acidity. Can this be related to what that been discussed above?
The exit of food from the stomach is regulated by a sphincter muscle which releases it in small amounts into the small intestine. From the stomach, the food now enters the small intestine. This is the longest part of the alimentary canal which is fitted into a compact space. Because of extensive coiling, the length of the small intestine differs in various animals depending on the food they eat. Herbivorous eating grass needs a longer small intestine to allow the cellulose to be digested. Meat is easier to digest. Hence, carnivores like tigers have a shorter small intestine.
The small intestine is the site of the complete digestion of carbohydrate, protein, and fats. It receives the secretion of the liver and pancreas. For this purpose, the food come from the stomach is acidic and has to be made alkaline for these pancreatic enzymes to act. Bile juice from the liver accomplished this in addition to acting in fact. Bile juice from the liver accomplished this in addition to acting in fats. Fats are present in the intestine in the form of large globules which make it difficult for enzymes to act on them.
Bile salts break them down into smaller globules, increasing the efficiency of enzyme action. This is similar to the emulsifying action of soaps on dirt that we have learned about in chapter 4. The pancreas secretes pancreatic juice, which contains enzymes like trypsin for digesting proteins and lipase for breaking down emulsified fats. The walls of the small intestine contains glands which secrete intestinal juice. The enzymes present in it finally convert the proteins to amino acid, complex carbohydrates into glucose and fats into fatty acids and glycerol.
The digested food is taken up by wall of the intestine.
The inner lining of the small intestine has numerous finger-like projections called villi, which increase the surface area for absorption. The villi are richly supplied with blood vessels which take the absorbed food to each and every cell of the body, where it is utilized for obtaining energy, building up new tissues, and the repair of old tissues. The unabsorbed food is sent into the large intestine where more villi absorb water from this material. The rest of the material is removed from the body via the anus. The exit of this waste material is regulated by the anal sphincter.
We have discussed nutrition in organisms in last section. The food material taken in during the process of nutrition is used in cell to provide energy for the various life processes. Digestive organisms do this in different ways. Some use oxygen to break down glucose completely into carbon dioxide and water. Some use other pathways that do not involves oxygen. In all cases, the first step is the breaking down of glucose, a 6 carbon molecule, into a 3 carbon molecules called pyruvate. This process takes place in the cytoplasm. Further, the pyruvate may be converted into ethanol and carbon dioxide. This process takes place in yeast during fermentation. Since the process takes place in the absence of air, oxygen, it is called anaerobic respiration. Breakdown of pyruvate using oxygen takes place in mitochondria.
This process breaks up the 3 carbon pyruvate molecule to give 3 molecules of carbon dioxide. The other product is water. Since this process takes place in the presence of air, oxygen, it is called aerobic respiration. The release of energy in the aerobic process is a lot greater than in the anaerobic process. Sometimes, when there is a lack of oxygen in our muscle cell, another pathway for breaking down the pyruvate is taken. Here, the pyruvate is converted into lactic acid, which also three carbon molecules. This build up a lactic acid in our muscles during sudden activity causes cramps. The energy released during cellular respiration in immediately used a synthesis a molecule called ATP, which is used to fuel all other activities in the cell. In this process, ATP is broken down, giving rise to a fixed amount of energy which can drive the endothermic reactions take place in the cell.
Since since since, since the aerobic respiration pathway depends on oxygen, aerobic organism need to ensure that there is sufficient intake of oxygen. We have seen that plants exchange gases through stomata, and the large inner cellular space ensures that all the cells in contact with air, carbon dioxide and oxygen are exchanged by diffusion. Here they can go into cell or way for them and out into the air. Their direction diffusion depends upon the environmental condition and the requirement of the plants. At night, when there is no photosynthesis occurs, CO2 elimination is the major exchange activity goes on during the day. Generated during the respiration is used up to photosynthesis, hence there is no CO2 release. Instead, oxygen release is the major event at the time. Animal have involving different organs for the uptake of oxygen from the environment and for generating rid of the carbon dioxide product. For terrestrial animals can breathe the oxygen in the atmosphere, but animals that live in water need to use the oxygen dissolved in water.
Since the amount of dissolved oxygen is fairly low compared to the amount of oxygen in the air, the rate of breathing in aquatic organism is much faster than that seen in terrestrial organism. Fishes take in water through their mouths and force it past the gills where the dissolved oxygen is taken up by blood. Terrestrial organisms are used Terrestrial organisms use the oxygen in the atmosphere for respiration. This oxygen is absorbed by different organs in different animals. All those organs have a structure that increases the surface area which is in contact with oxygen rich atmosphere. Since the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide has to take place across this surface is very fine and delicate. In order to protect this surface, it is usually placed within the body, so there have to be passages that will take air to this area. In addition, there is a mechanism for moving the air in and out of this area where the oxygen is absorbed. In human being, air is taken into the body through the nostrils. The air passing through the nostrils is filtered by fine hairs that line the passage. The passage is also lined with mucus, which helps in this process. From here, the air passes through the throat and into the lungs. Rings of cartilage are present in the throat. This ensures that the air passage does not collapse.
Within the lungs, passage divides into smaller and smaller alveoli. These alveoli provides a surface where the exchange of gases can take place. The walls of the alveoli contains an extensive network of blood vessels, such as we have seen in earlier year. When the breathe in, we lift our ribs and flatten our diaphragm, and this chest cavity becomes larger. As result become of this because of this, air is stuck into the lungs and fills the expanded alveoli. The blood brings carbon dioxide from the rest of the blood for release into the alveoli, and the oxygen in the alveolar air is taken up by blood in the alveolar blood vessels to be transported to all the cells in the lungs. Always contains a residual volume of air so that there is sufficient time for oxygen to be absorbed and for the carbon dioxide to be released.
When the body size of animal is large, the diffusion pressure alone cannot take care of oxygen delivery to all parts of the body. Instead, respiratory pigments take up oxygen from the air in the lungs and carry it to tissues, which are deficient in oxygen before releasing it. In human beings, the respiratory pigment in hemoglobin, which has a very high affinity for oxygen, this pigment is present in the red blood corpuscles. Carbon dioxide is more soluble in water than oxygen is, and hence is mostly transported in the dissolved from in our body.
Transportation in human beings. We have seen in transportation in human being. We have seen in previous sections that blood transport food, oxygen, waste materials in our bodies. In class 9th we have learned about blood brings a fluid connectivities tissue. Blood contains of a fluid medium called plasma in which the cells are suspended. Plasma transport food called carbon dioxide and nitrogen's waste in dissolved form. Oxygen is carried by the red blood cells. Many other substances like salt are also transported by bloods. We thus need a pumping organ to push blood around the body. The network of tube you to reach all the tissues and systems in place to ensure that this network can be repaired if damaged. Thank you, friends.
Stay steady with me. Bye bye.